The notification came through on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. World-changing moments should not arrive on Tuesdays. They should come with storms, or silence, or at least a decent hour of the morning. Instead, mine arrived at 9:42 in the morning while I was standing in a narrow corridor aboard the diplomatic station Meridian 7, holding a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, reading an alert that said humanity had just been selected for elimination. Not elimination in the quiet paperwork kind of way. The formal, public broadcastic 40-star systems kind. I am Maravas. I am 28 years old. I work as a combat attaché for the United Nations Galactic Defense Force, which is a very long title that means I wear a dress uniform to diplomatic events and stand near people who matter while trying to look like I also matter. I speak 4 languages. I qualified expert on 11 weapons platforms. And for the past 6 months I have been the lowest-ranking human representative aboard the most important diplomatic station in the known galaxy. I want to be clear about that last part, because it becomes relevant very quickly. The Interstellar Concord Summit happened every 4 years. Every species with a recognized seat at the Concord brought their best diplomats, their most impressive titles, and their most uncomfortable formal attire. Humanity brought Ambassador Dale Whitmore, 2 senior advisors named Carol Bench and Gregory Holt, and me. I was there because interstellar diplomatic protocol required any delegation to include at least 1 combat-certified individual. It was an old rule, written after an incident nobody liked to discuss, and it had never once been relevant in modern summit history. Until now I read the alert 3 times. Then I walked back into the main observation lounge, where Ambassador Whitmore was standing with Carol and Gregory, all 3 of them, looking at the large central display, with the particular stillness of people who have just received very bad news, and have not yet decided how to react to it. The display showed the arena. Every species that wanted full Concord membership had to go through it eventually. The championship right. It was ancient, older than half the civilizations currently sitting around the council table, and it worked like this. A species seeking a permanent seat could be challenged by any recognized member. The challenger sent their greatest champion. The challenged species sent their own. They met in the arena. The outcome determined whether the challenging species had the right to demand the challenged species vacate their candidacy permanently. It was, in the most formal diplomatic language possible, a fight for the right to exist at the table. The Vrethkai had just invoked it against us. I had studied the Vrethkai before the summit. It was my job to study everyone. They were crystalline species, which sounds beautiful until you understand what it actually means. Their bodies were structured around interlocking mineral composites, grown from birth in specific configurations that made them, in practical terms, walking armor. They stood between 6 and 7.5 feet tall. They had 4 upper limbs, 2 primary and 2 secondary, all of which could be used in combat. Their exoskeleton had been tested, in treaty-required disclosures to withstand impacts that would destroy a human body several times over. Their champion was named Korvash. He had been fighting in formal challenge matches since he was 19 years old. He was now 57. In 38 years of competition, he had never lost, not once, not a single match, not a single round, not even a close call that any commentator had been able to point to and say, "There, that was the moment it could have gone differently." 314 consecutive victories across 17 species. He had ended 4 candidacies personally. The species whose candidacies he had ended were still out there, still alive, but they had never been invited back to the table. He had chosen us. The broadcast of his selection announcement was still playing on the display when I walked in. I caught the end of it. He was standing in the formal challenge circle, dressed in full ceremonial Vrethkai honor plating, which added another 2 inches to his height and made him look like something that had been carved from a mountain specifically to end arguments. His translator was broadcasting his words in standard Concord common speech, and he was saying, in a voice that filled the chamber like a slow tide, that he had reviewed the candidate species and had determined that humanity represented the most appropriate demonstration target. Demonstration target, not even opponent target. There was laughter in the observation feeds from the other delegations' lounges. Not cruel laughter exactly. More the kind of laughter that comes from watching something inevitable unfold exactly as expected. A few of the Concord Council members were smiling. One of the Drithali delegates leaned toward another and said something I could not hear, but I could read the shape of the words well enough. Ambassador Whitmore turned to look at me. He was a careful man, Dale Whitmore, good at his job. He had been doing this for 30 years, and he had navigated situations that would have broken most people twice over. Right now, He looked like he was holding himself very carefully upright, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who needed to ask something he did not want to ask. "Mara," he said quietly. "I know," I said. "You're the only no," I said again. The rules were clear. The challenged species had 12 hours to name a champion. If no champion was named, the candidacy was automatically forfeit. There were no extensions, no exceptions, no procedural workarounds that Carol and Gregory had not already spent the last 10 minutes trying to find. I could see from the look on Gregory's face that they had found nothing. I set my cold coffee down on the edge of the display console. The hall outside our lounge had gone quieter than it usually was. Sound carried differently on Meridian 7 than it did on Earth. The stations was built from a composite material that absorbed certain frequencies, which meant that normal conversation disappeared into the walls, but the low resonance of a crowd reacting to news carried through the floor. I could feel it in my boots right now. That particular low vibration that meant everyone in the station knew what had just happened, and most of them found it interesting in the way that people find something interesting when it is happening to someone else. I looked at the display one more time. Korvash was still standing in the challenge circle, receiving congratulations from Vrethkai delegation members who were filing past him in what appeared to be a formal line of acknowledgement. He looked comfortable, relaxed, the way a person looks when they have already finished something in their mind and are simply waiting for the physical reality to catch up. I thought about that, about the gap between what someone believes is about to happen and what is actually about to happen. In my experience, that gap was where everything interesting lived. "I'll do it," I said. Ambassador Whitmore let out a breath. Carol pressed her lips together and nodded. Gregory looked at his datapad and then looked away, which was his way of dealing with things he could not solve with research. I left the lounge to go file the formal acceptance paperwork. The corridor outside was quiet. A few delegates from other species passed me as I walked, and I noticed the way their eyes tracked to me, and then away again, quickly, with the practiced indifference of people who did not want to be caught looking. One Drethali official actually stopped walking when he saw me, as if he had expected me to appear more troubled than I did, and my ordinary pace had confused him. I kept walking. I had 12 hours and a paperwork form to file, and somewhere in the treaty database, there was information that nobody had thought to read. I intended to read all of it. At the end of the corridor, I passed a viewport. Outside, the stars were doing what stars always did, which was nothing, steadily, forever. I had grown up in a city where you could never see them properly. I had spent 6 months on this station, and I still was not used to how many there were, or how far they went. 40 star systems watching. Millions of eyes, most of them expecting a brief, efficient, forgettable result. I thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I went to find the database terminal, and I started reading. First thing I did after filing the acceptance form was go back to my quarters and close the door. Not to fall apart. I want to be clear about that. I closed the door because I needed quiet, and because what I was about to do required focus, and because the kind of focus I needed could not happen in a corridor with Drethali delegates walking past and looking at me like I was already a historical footnote. My quarters on Meridian 7 were small. All the human delegation quarters were small. We had been assigned rooms in a section of the station originally designed for a species called the Kethari, who were roughly human-sized but preferred lower ceilings and narrower doorways. The result was a room that felt like someone had tried to build a normal space and then changed their mind halfway through. I had lived in smaller places. I did not mind it. I sat down at my desk, opened my datapad, and pulled up Korvash's full combat record. I had looked at it before the summit briefly as part of a general briefing on Vrethkai political power. I had noted his record and moved on, because at that point there had been no reason to look closer. Now I looked closer. 314 fights. I started from the beginning and worked forward. His first recorded match had been at 19, against a much older and more experienced Vrethkai opponent in an internal ranking competition. He had won in 40 seconds. The analyst at the time had noted his speed and the precision of his opening combination, and had predicted a strong competitive career. They had undersold it considerably. By his 30th fight, the pattern was clear. He did not win by overwhelming power, though he had plenty of that. He won by control. Every match followed a structure. He opened with the traditional Shrek Doom stance sequence, which was a formalized display inherited from ancient Vrethkai combat tradition. The sequence was slow by design. It was a ritual, originally intended to give both parties a moment to acknowledge the gravity of the challenge before combat began. In Korvash's hands, it had become something else. It had become a performance. He used it to read his opponent, to let the crowd settle, and to establish the rhythm of the match entirely on his own terms. Every opponent had waited for the sequence to end before engaging, every single one, not because they were required to, because it simply did not occur to them to do otherwise. The Shriek-Doom opening was tradition. You waited, you observed, you responded when the time came. I stopped at that thought and held it for a while. I pulled up the physiological disclosure files next. Every species seeking Concord membership had to submit detailed biological data as part of the candidate review process. It was framed as a medical and safety requirement, and technically it was. The practical effect was a database of physical information about every candidate species that anyone with access could read. Most people did not read it in detail. Most people were not combat attaché preparing for a formal challenge match. I read it in detail. The Vrethkai file was thorough. Exoskeletal composition, load tolerances, joint structure, sensory ranges, neurological response data. I went through all of it. Some of it I had covered in basic xenobiology training. Some of it was new. Near the end of the file, in a section labeled Medical Safety Considerations for Physical Interaction Protocols, I found what I had been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. The Vrethkai exoskeleton was not complete coverage, almost but not quite. There were 18 points on a Vrethkai body where the exoskeletal plates did not fully meet, left intentionally open to allow for the movement of limbs and sensory organs. These were documented as pressure sensitivity zones, flagged for medical personnel so that any physical contact during examinations could avoid causing involuntary pain responses. I read the description of each one twice. Then I read the neurological section again, more carefully. There was a cluster of nerve tissue beneath the left mandible plate, in the gap between the lower face armor and the throat casing. It was described in the file as a high-density sensory relay point, used primarily for detecting vibration and proximity. The file noted that direct compression of this area could cause a temporary disruption of the primary motor signal pathway, resulting in loss of voluntary movement in the lower limbs and temporary impairment of upper limb coordination. Recovery time was listed as 15 to 25 minutes, no lasting effects. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I opened a second file and started working out angles. Around midnight, I called my old drill sergeant. His name was Owen Grady, and he had been training soldiers for 22 years. And he was one of approximately 4 people in the world whose opinion I trusted completely, without having to think about it. The call connected after 2 rings, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had already heard. His face appeared on my screen. He looked exactly the same as he always did, which was like someone had taken a very stubborn piece of stone and taught it to make expressions. "Voss," he said, Grady. He looked at me for a moment. I looked back. 7 feet, exoskeleton, 38 years unbeaten. "That's right, and they put you in a room with it, more or less." He was quiet for a few seconds. I could hear the faint sound of wind somewhere near where he was, which meant he was sitting by an open window. He did that sometimes when he could not sleep. "You've already found something," he said. It was not a question. "I've found a few things. Medical file. The safety disclosure database." He made a small sound that from Owen Grady was the equivalent of a laugh. "Of course you did." He looked at me steadily. "You know what to do, Voss. You always have. I wanted to hear you say it." I said it. "Go sleep. I will, Mara." He used my first name rarely enough that I paid attention when he did. "They picked you because there was nobody else. That's how they see it. Make sure it's the last time they see it that way." I ended the call and sat quietly for a minute. Then I went back to the file and worked through the angles again, slower this time, checking each one. I was not looking for the most powerful approach. I was looking for the most precise one. There is a significant difference, and understanding that difference had kept me functional in situations where raw power would have been entirely insufficient. The strike I was working toward was not complicated. That was the thing about it that kept drawing me back. It did not require exceptional strength. It required specific positioning, a correct angle of approach, 2 contact points applied simultaneously, and enough pressure to activate the nerve cluster's disruption response. I had hit harder things. I had hit more defended things. I had hit targets while tired, while frightened, while working with equipment I had never trained on. This was simpler than most of what I had done. What it required more than anything was timing, and the timing depended on one thing: that Korvash would begin his traditional opening stance sequence, because he always began his traditional opening stance sequence, and that in the 0.3-second window between the initiation of that sequence and his first committed movement, I would already be moving, not after he finished. Before he started, the risk was not the strike itself. The risk was the idea that I would move first, that I would close distance before he had finished his ritual, that I would, in the language of every combat instructor I had ever trained under, seize the initiative and refuse to give it back. Every opponent he had faced in 314 fights had given it back. They had stood and watched the opening sequence, because tradition said to wait, because waiting felt respectful, felt measured, felt like the right thing to do in a formal challenge match watched by millions. I was not planning to be respectful in that particular way. I ran the approach 7 times in the limited open space of my quarters, slow at first and then at speed. I was not practicing the strike exactly. I was practicing the decision, the moment of choosing to move. That was the thing that needed to be automatic. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I stopped and ate the rest of a nutrition bar I had left on my desk and drank some water. Then I set an alarm for 7, stretched out on my bunk in my clothes, and went to sleep. I know that sounds like I am presenting myself as fearless, and I want to correct that impression. I was not fearless. Fear is a function, not a flaw. I had learned years ago that the way to work with fear was not to suppress it, but to give it a job. That night my fear had a job. It had been running calculations all evening, checking angles, reviewing files, identifying gaps. It had been extremely productive. When it ran out of productive work to do, it got quiet, and then I slept. The alarm went off at 7. I silenced it, sat up, and went through my standard morning routine. I brushed my teeth, I washed my face. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the sink for a moment. Not for any particular reason, just to look. I looked fine. A little tired around the eyes, but fine. At 7:40, I went to the station dining area and ate a full breakfast. Eggs, reconstituted but decent. Coffee that was actually warm for once because I had gotten there before the morning rush. I was halfway through my eggs when I noticed 2 Vrethkai members of the delegation's support staff at a table across the room. They were watching me. Not openly, not aggressively, just with the careful attention of people who had been asked to observe something, and were finding the observation unexpectedly confusing. I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip and looked out the viewport instead. Whatever they were expecting to see in my biometrics, in my posture, in the way I moved through an ordinary morning, they were not seeing it. I knew this because I had read enough xenopsychology to understand that every species that had ever faced Corvash had shown measurable stress indicators in the hours before a match. And those stress indicators were part of what he used to build his read on an opponent before they even entered the arena. I had no intention of giving him useful data. I finished my breakfast, cleared my tray, and walked back toward my quarters to collect my gear. The match was in 4 hours. I was thinking about angle of approach. The corridor to the arena floor was 240 meters long, which I know because I counted my steps. I had not counted them on purpose. It was just something my brain did when it needed to stay occupied, without interfering with the part that was running the actual operational thinking. My steps were even and unhurried, and my hands were at my sides. I was wearing my standard issue GDF field uniform, which was not ceremonial and not impressive and fit well because I had broken it in over 2 years of regular use. I had my standard issue field equipment, which I had checked twice that morning, and once in the corridor outside my quarters before leaving. I was not carrying anything unusual. I did not need to. The most important thing I was carrying was a specific piece of information about a nerve cluster, and that was already in my head where nobody could take it from me. The noise from the arena was audible from about 100 meters out. Meridian 7 had been built with sound-absorbing materials throughout most of its structure. But the arena was different. The arena was meant to be heard. It was designed to amplify and project, to make the crowd feel larger than it was and the space feel significant. The result was a low, rolling sound that came through the floor and the walls and the air simultaneously, like being inside something breathing. I had been in loud environments before. I had done training exercises in spaces where the noise was intended as a disorienting factor, and I had learned early that the way to deal with pervasive sound was to find one thing that was not the sound and focus on it. Right now I was focusing on the even pressure of my boots against the corridor floor. Firm, consistent, reliable. I kept my breathing steady and my pace unchanged. At the end of the corridor, there was a waiting area, a small antechamber with a bench and a water dispenser, and a narrow viewport that looked out into the side of the arena bowl rather than the floor. I did not sit on the bench. I stood near the viewport and looked at what I could see. The arena was enormous, larger than it had appeared on the briefing holos, which was saying something. The seating extended upward in a wide, steep curve that I could only partially see from my angle, and what I could see was nearly full. Species I recognized and species I did not, arranged in delegation sections, the combined visual effect being a mosaic of forms and colors that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The arena floor itself was approximately 80 meters across, roughly circular, made of compressed mineral composite in a shade that was somewhere between gray and pale gold. Even lighting from overhead, no shadows anywhere on the floor. Good visibility from every angle in the seating. I noted the gravity. Slightly lower than Earth standard, as expected from the briefing files. Slightly lower gravity meant faster movement and slightly reduced impact force, which affected a few things I had been calculating and which I had already adjusted for. The atmosphere inside the arena was oxygen standard, same as the rest of the station. I had confirmed this because it mattered. In lower oxygen environments, fine motor precision degraded. In standard oxygen, I was operating at my normal capacity, and normal capacity was what I needed. I drank some water from the dispenser. Not because I was particularly thirsty, but because hydration affected fine motor function, and there was no reason not to. A few minutes before the entry signal, a station official came to the antechamber door. He was a heathery, which was a mid-sized species with blue-gray skin and large amber eyes that were currently expressing what I recognized from prior experience as uncomfortable sympathy. The heathery were an emotionally communicative species. They wore their feelings visibly and consistently, and this one was wearing something very close to the expressions of a person accompanying someone to a difficult appointment. "Specialist Voss," he said carefully. "It is nearly time." "Thank you," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "You may take additional time in the antechamber if you wish. Protocol allows. I don't need additional time," I said. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something kind, but could not find the right words. I understood the impulse. I did not hold it against him. The entry signal chimed. I walked through the antechamber door. The wall of sound hit first. Not loud exactly. Not the kind of noise that hurts, but layered in a way that was almost physical. A pressure that came from every direction at once. The crowd was large, and the crowd was loud, and the crowd was very much not paying attention to the side entrance where I was walking out. They were paying attention to the main entrance, where Korvash had just emerged. I watched him enter from across the arena floor. The Vrethkai knew how to make an entrance. That was the first thing I thought. Korvash came through the main arch, with the particular ease of someone who had done this so many times that every motion was precisely calibrated, and every calibration had been calibrated again, until it appeared effortless. His honor plating caught the arena lighting, and scattered it across the nearest rows of spectators. He was moving at a slow, deliberate pace that said, clearly and in no uncertain terms, "There is no hurry. There is absolutely no hurry at all. Everything is proceeding exactly as expected." The crowd responded to him the way a crowd responds to something it already knows is exceptional, not with surprise but with recognition. The sound that came up from 40,000 seats was not the sound of being impressed. It was the sound of being confirmed. He reached the center of the arena floor and stopped. I had crossed about a third of the distance from my entry gate to the center. I was not walking fast and I was not walking particularly slow. I was walking at the pace I had decided on, which was the pace that would get me to the right position at the right time, without telegraphing anything about what that position was for. The sound in the arena shifted as people began to notice me, not dramatically, more the way a room shifts when someone unexpected walks in, a recalibration of attention. Some of it was the kind of attention that comes from pity, or from the particular uncomfortable interest people have in watching something that they believe is about to go badly. Some of it was simple curiosity. The human was smaller than expected. The human was walking calmly. The human did not appear to be overwhelmed by the arena, the crowd, or the 7-foot crystalline champion standing in the center of the floor. A commentator's voice came through the arena's broadcast system, translating in real time for Concord Common Speech. I caught a fragment of it, representing the human candidate species, whose chances the council assessors have rated as. I stopped listening. I was at about the halfway point between my entry gate and the arena center. I stopped walking. I was not going to the center. I want to explain this because it was not a mistake or an oversight. I had calculated my position carefully. The traditional format of the championship right required both champions to meet at the arena center before the match signal. I had read the rule text 3 times. What it actually said was that both champions should be present and ready on the arena floor before the match signal sounded. Was traditional. Center was expected. Center was not required. Korvash was at the center. I was not. I was standing in the space between my entry gate and the center, and I was close enough to him that what I needed to do was possible. And I was far enough from him that he was not yet fully focused on me as a specific threat. He turned toward me. He was reading me the way he read every opponent. I could see it in the set of his posture, the slight angle of his sensory plates. He was collecting information, running his own calculations. I gave him nothing useful. I stood still and I kept my face neutral and my breathing even, and I watched him back. The arena protocol official announced the start of the formal pre-match address. Corv Vash straightened to his full height and began to speak. His voice was deep and carried beautifully in the arena's acoustic design. The translation came through the broadcast system a half-second behind his words. He began with his lineage. The Vrethkai tracked lineage carefully, and his was impressive. 5 generations of recognized champions going back to the original Shrek Doom Masters. He named each of them. He named their victories. He named the match that had established his own career and the ones that had defined it. He had been speaking for 2 minutes. I had been watching his posture, his weight distribution, the position of his 4 limbs. He was moving toward the Shrek Doom opening sequence, not yet performing it, but moving toward it. The way a person moves their hands before picking something up, the body preparing to do something familiar before the mind fully commits. 3 minutes. He was describing his most recent formal match, a challenge against a Drethali candidate 4 years ago, and the crowd was with him, fully with him. The way a crowd gets with a performer who has done this enough times to know exactly where the peaks are. He was almost done. Protocol allowed the challenged champion a response before the match signal. I had been thinking about what to say for most of the morning. Not to be clever, or memorable, or to perform something for the relay feeds. I had been thinking about what would serve the actual purpose, which was to communicate, as efficiently as possible, that the terms of this engagement were not going to be what anyone in this arena was expecting them to be. Korvash finished his address. The echo of his voice faded through the arena. The protocol official opened the response period. I stepped to the nearest broadcast pickup, which was a floor-mounted unit about 4 meters to my left. I walked to it without hurrying. I looked up at the arena, at 40,000 spectators from 40 star systems, at the relay feeds that were broadcasting this to every planet with a connection to the Concord network. I said, I have heard enough, let us get this done. 7 words. The arena went quiet. Not the polite transitional quiet between one speaker and the next. Actually quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected breaks the rhythm of a situation that was moving in a known direction and suddenly is not moving in that direction anymore. Even the broadcast commentary cut out for a moment. Korvash was looking at me. He was not moving. He had been moving toward the opening of the Shrek Doom sequence. I could see it in his posture. But he had stopped. Something in what I had said, or in the way I had said it, or in the fact that I had said it at all, had triggered a response in his combat-trained instincts that did not match what he had been preparing for. He was recalibrating. That was fine, he could recalibrate. He had about 4 seconds to do it. The match signal chimed. The signal was a single tone, clear and resonant, designed to carry across the entire arena floor. I was already moving when it finished sounding. Not running. Running is for covering distance quickly, and covering distance quickly was not what I needed. What I needed was a specific approach line at a specific angle, with a specific amount of controlled acceleration that would get me to a precise point at a precise moment, and running was too fast and too committed and too likely to telegraph the destination before I reached it. I moved the way I had practiced it in my quarters, not like an attack, like a correction, like someone adjusting their position. Korvash began the Shrek Doom opening. I had watched it 314 times in recorded footage, and I had counted the timing on every single one of them. And I knew this. The initiation of the sequence, the first movement of the primary limbs into the opening configuration, took between 280 and 320 milliseconds before the first committed defensive stance was established. That was the window. That was the 0.3 seconds I had spent most of the night thinking about. He was in the window. I was 4 steps away. 3 steps, he was still opening the sequence. His primary limbs were moving to the first position. His weight was shifting to receive it. His sensory plates were oriented slightly upward, toward where an opponent of average opponent height would be, if they were approaching in the traditional way, from the traditional distance. I was not at the traditional distance. I had never gone to the center of the arena. I was 3 meters from my entry gate, and 4 steps from him, and I was approaching from an angle 17 degrees off his primary sensory orientation, and his combat instincts were very good. They were among the best in the galaxy, but they were calibrated for opponents who waited for the sequence to finish, and I had not waited. 2 steps. I brought my right hand up into the specific configuration I had drilled 7 times in my quarters. 2-point contact, index and middle finger together, applying force as a single unit rather than separately. The angle had to be precise because the nerve cluster was small and the window of the plating gap was narrow. But the angle was precise because I had calculated it against his disclosed physiology and then recalculated it 3 times. One step, he registered me. I saw it happen, the micro-adjustment of his sensory plates, the beginning of a response movement in his secondary limbs. His reflexes were extraordinary. Under normal circumstances, in a normal approach, that response would have been more than fast enough. This was not a normal approach. I was already at the contact point. My fingers found the gap beneath the left mandible plate. The gap was exactly where the medical disclosure had said it would be. The nerve cluster was exactly where the neurological map had said it would be. The angle was what I had calculated. I applied pressure, not a strike in the conventional sense. A compression, specific, sustained, deliberate. The nerve cluster disruption response, according to the disclosure file, required approximately 1.4 seconds of sustained correct angle pressure to activate fully. I held it for 2. Corvash's legs stopped working. He came down with the slow, controlled inevitability of something very large that has lost its structural support. Not a collapse, not a fall, more like a building settling. His secondary limbs caught some of the descent, and he ended up on one knee, and then on both, and then his upper body followed, and then he was on the arena floor. He was completely still. The Arena Medical System's automated announcement came through the broadcast speakers 6 seconds later, confirming temporary motor disruption and no physical injury. Recovery time estimated at 18 to 22 minutes, all vital signs stable. I stepped back. I was standing 2.5 meters from my entry gate. I had crossed approximately that distance from the moment the match signal sounded to the moment Corvash was on the floor. I had not set foot in the main arena space. I had not reached the center. I had not taken what anyone watching would classify as a full crossing stride. I turned and faced the council viewing box. I waited. The arena was silent in a way that arenas are very rarely silent. Not the held breath before something happens. The held breath after something has happened and no one has yet decided what to do with it. I stayed where I was. I kept my hands at my sides and my breathing even, and I looked at the council box and waited for the arbitration process to run its course. Somewhere in the upper seating a sound started, small at first. It took me a moment to identify it because it was not the kind of sound I had been expecting, and it was not coming from where I expected it to come from. It was coming from a section near the upper left, which the pre-match seating chart had indicated was allocated to smaller candidate species, non-member observers who were present at the summit, but did not yet have recognized seats. They were not making the sound that the Vrethkai delegation was making, which was silence of a very particular and brittle kind. They were making the sound of people who had just seen something they had not thought possible, and were not yet sure they were allowed to react to it. I kept waiting. The arbitration council deliberated for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. I know this because I counted. I was still standing in the same position, 2.5 meters from my entry gate, when the head arbitrator's voice came through the arena broadcast system. He was a Heathery, which perhaps explained the slight unevenness in his tone. The Heathery, as I have mentioned, wore their feelings clearly. Right now his voice carried something that was not quite neutrality. The championship right match between the Vrethkai Challenge delegation and the human candidate representative is concluded, he said. The match is valid under all applicable protocols of the Interstellar Concord. The human candidate representative is recognized as the victor. The human candidate species retains its candidacy in full, and is hereby elevated to provisional full membership pending standard review. There was a long moment after that where the arena did not do anything specific. Then it did several things at once. The Vrethkai delegation section produced an immediate and formal protest, delivered through their senior delegate, citing what she described as procedural irregularity in the approach method. The protest was logged. The arbitration panel reviewed it for approximately 90 seconds before the head arbitrator confirmed that nothing in the rights governing protocols specified approach method, position requirements, or stride count. The match was valid. The protest was denied. Corvash, meanwhile, had been assisted to its sitting position by the arena's medical team. They were working quickly and professionally, and he was recovering ahead of the estimated timeline, which the medical announcement attributed to his exceptional baseline physical condition. He was sitting up on the arena floor with 2 medics nearby, and his sensory plates were oriented toward me. I walked over to him, not because protocol required it, Not because I was trying to make a point to anyone watching. I walked over because he had been in that arena 314 times, and he had never been on the floor. And I thought that deserved something more than being left there, while everyone else dealt with the administrative aftermath. I stopped a few feet from him and looked down at him, and he looked up at me. His face did not have the configuration for the human expressions I was used to reading. But I had been studying Vrethkai physiognomy for 2 days, and I could read the position of his sensory plates well enough to get a general impression. He was not angry. He was something more complicated than angry. I nodded once. Not a victory gesture, not a performance for the relay feeds. Just the acknowledgement one person gives another when they have been through something together, and there is nothing adequate to say about it. He looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded back. I heard the change in the arena sound when he did it. The particular frequency shift of 40,000 observers reacting to something they had not predicted. I did not look up to see it. I was still looking at Korvash, and he was still looking at me, and whatever was happening between us in that moment was not for the relay feeds. I straightened up and walked back toward the exit gate. Ambassador Whitmore was waiting in the corridor outside. Carol was with him. Gregory was behind them both, looking at his datapad, and then looking up, and then looking at his datapad again. Dale Whitmore had the expression of someone who had spent 3 hours preparing to receive very bad news, and had received the opposite, and had not yet fully adjusted his face to reflect this. Mara, he said. Ambassador, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, good work, which, from Dale Whitmore, was a significant statement. Carol said, the relay feeds clip the 7 words. It's already running on 19 separate broadcast networks. I had expected something like that. Not the specific number, but the principle. 7 words was short enough to clip, and specific enough to be quotable, and ambiguous enough that every species watching could find their own meaning in it. I was not going to complain about that. Gregory looked up from his datapad long enough to say, the Rakari delegation has requested an informal meeting with our team at the earliest opportunity. He paused. So has the Sethali Collective and the Orvani Observer Group. Schedule them, I said. He nodded and went back to his datapad. I walked with Ambassador Whitmore toward the delegation area, and we did not say much more than that. There would be time later for the full debrief, the diplomatic analysis, the scheduling of meetings that would reshape what humanity's position in the Concord looked like going forward. There was a great deal of work ahead. There was always a great deal of work ahead. That evening, in my quarters, I received a message from Earth. It was from the Secretary General, whose name was Philip Oates, and it read, we are giving you a promotion. Effective immediately. I thought about that for a moment. Then I replied, thank you, sir. I would also like a better coffee machine in the attaché quarters. The current one produces something that is technically warm and nothing else. He replied 4 minutes later with a text that said, done. Both of them I put the datapad down. I had eaten dinner. I had filed my post-match report, which was thorough and accurate, and contained no editorializing, because post-match reports are not the place for editorializing. I had responded to Carol's message about the relay feed clips, with a note saying I would review them in the morning. I had confirmed Gregory's meeting schedule, which now ran through the next 3 days without a gap. I sat on my bunk and looked at the ceiling for a while. The thing about being underestimated is that people do it because it makes their world simpler. It is easier to know where you stand if everything around you is sorted into categories that do not shift. Strong and weak, advanced and primitive, worth watching and not worth watching. The Vrethkai and the Concord and everyone watching on those relay feeds had sorted humanity into a category years before I walked into that arena. They had done it because the category seemed obvious and stable, and because nothing we had done up to that point had given them a reason to reconsider. The category was wrong. Not because humans were secretly stronger than everyone else. Not because we had hidden advantages or ancient power or some dormant ability that just needed the right moment to emerge. We were not stronger than Korvash. We were not faster. We were not more durable. We were something else. We were the species that got frightened and made spreadsheets, that read the fine print in the safety disclosures, that called someone at 3 a.m. and asked to hear a familiar voice say a familiar thing, that went to sleep for 6 hours the night before a match against a champion, with 314 consecutive victories, and then woke up and had breakfast, and then walked a 240-meter corridor counting steps, and then said 7 words into a broadcast pickup and meant every one of them. We were the species that had been closing gaps since before most of the Concord's founding members had written language. And we had never once stopped. I lay back on my bunk. Outside the viewport, the stars were doing what they always did, which was nothing, steadily, forever. 40-star systems, millions of eyes. And somewhere in the upper section of a diplomatic arena, a group of small candidate species who had never been considered worth watching were playing back 7 words on a loop and finding something in them that I had not put there intentionally, but was glad was there regardless. I closed my eyes. I was asleep in 6 minutes. My biometrics were, I was later told, completely steady throughout. Some things do not change. That is one of them.